and welcome to our Bible Ponder for this week. I thought that I would do a video with something that was just sort of piquing my interest, and I don't know why it's something that I haven't necessarily talked about in a Bible Ponder yet, but I think it's interesting, and I think you'll find it interesting as well. And it gets to that point of whenever we say the Lord's Prayer, obviously there's different versions of it. Some are more modern, where we make the language a bit updated and take out kind of the these and thous. And then because so many of us learned it with these and thous, that version still persists, and that's the one we use in church, and we still say all of it in a very traditional way. But there's one word that we tend to still swap out, even if we're using a traditional or a modern version, and that is the word debts. I think it's pretty common in our part of the world to use the word debts in the Lord's Prayer. And the verse I'm talking about is, of course, Matthew 6, 12, which is the version of the Lord's Prayer we normally use for Matthew 6. And it says, "Forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors." That's the modern NIV translation, the pretty recently updated one. And we use that sometimes in very old versions. You might see the word trespasses, which is another word for wrongdoing. And that's also then where we see the third variation, which is sins. "Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us." So debts and sins, with trespasses kind of in the middle there, can seem somewhat far apart, right, for our English ears. And this makes a little bit of sense until you kind of tease it out a bit. So if we are to even think about it in English, we use the word debts for kind of two reasons. One is the literal financial sort of debt that has a very concrete meaning. We talk about being in debt or having debt, things like having a mortgage, having a credit card, or various other kinds of debt that we take on in the course of maybe in your rolling year with your gas and electric bills. You might end up at a certain point in debt, or in debit, as it's called, in kind of the wintertime, that you make up for that in the summertime with your regular payments. And that's the kind of concrete version of debts. And so that's often what we think about. So when we say, "Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors," we do think of that concrete kind of financial term. And that's especially in the news with, in America, the forgiveness of a certain amount of student loan debt. But debt also does have another meaning for us in English. We can talk about kind of an emotional debt. And this kind of comes in a sort of passive way. We talk about being indebted to someone, or I owe someone a debt of gratitude, right? So even in English, we do have two senses for the word debt. And in Greek, it was the same. So you have the word debt, or be indebted, and that does have an alternate meaning of, it has the sense of money and financial debt, and it also has the sense of just being indebted to, or in some sort of a stretch, you can talk about the idea of a sin being a sort of debt that you've accrued, right? And so that's where we get the confusion. But in Matthew chapter 6, the words that are used there in Greek for "forgive us our debts as we forgive those who are our debtors or indebted to us," is the normal word that we would use for a normal debt, kind of financial debt. But again, it can have kind of that dual meaning in Greek, but it is the word for debt, because there is a different word for sin that we normally see in Greek. Trespasses is just another old-timey kind of term for a wrongdoing, in the same way that still kind of lives on in certain sectors of our laws. But so in Matthew chapter 6, it really is probably the best translation to say debts. And so then we can stretch it to say sins. But here's where it gets interesting. So there's another version of the Lord's Prayer in Luke. Similarly with the rest of Luke's kind of Sermon on the Plain, which is very similar to Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, but shortened in some ways. So Matthew has the Beatitudes. Luke has something similar, but again, they're slightly different. And we have a version of the Lord's Prayer. And this is Luke's version of the Lord's Prayer. Again, this is the NIV. And he said to them, when you pray, say, Father, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come. Give us each day our daily bread. Forgive us our sins, for we also forgive everyone who sins against us. And lead us not into temptation. Then Jesus said, suppose you have a friend, and he goes on. So it's a very truncated version of the prayer that we also see in Matthew chapter 6. But here's where it's interesting. And you see the NIV has translated that sins, whereas in Matthew chapter 6, it does translate it debts. And here is why that is. And this is interesting in that one sentence, in chapter 11, verse 4. In the Greek, it does use that normal word for sin, but only in the first instance. So it says, and forgive us our sins. That is the normal word for sin, as we also forgive those who are indebted to us. But it uses that normal word for debt that we also see in Matthew chapter 6, that being indebted, that kind of passive word there. And so this has both. And so this is also probably where we get that sort of jump in translation from debts to sins that we see sometimes also in Matthew chapter 6, even though Matthew chapter 6 contains both words that are normally used just for debt. In Luke, we have both sin and debt. And so then you can see where that other flavor of the word of debt and being indebted to can come out of that, where we have sins in the first instance. And so is it being indebted to financially, whereas the first sort of bit is a sin and you're kind of juxtaposing those? Or is it that forgive us our sins as we also forgive those who owe us a debt, who have sinned against us, who have a who are in the sort of scorecard of life in our debt. And so that's also then where you get the jump. And I just think that's really interesting that we can see how these translations sort of play off of each other, whereas on first blush, debts and sins can seem like pretty different words. We can see how they begin to kind of meld together in a certain way of thinking in translation. So that's my Bible ponder for you. I hope that that's interesting. I hope that you find yourself pondering that this Sunday when we say the Lord's Prayer in church. And I hope that you have a good day and a good week. Thanks. Bye-bye.